This video is going to go over installing a roll of rear indent ribbon, as well as installing it if it breaks. Sometimes, for whatever reason, the ribbon, as it goes through the embosser here, will get up on top of this guide here and it'll cut it. But it's the same process regardless of whether you're installing a new roll or if you're putting a broken, after it breaks, putting it back on. And I'm going to try to do this without getting my hands in the way so that we can see as much as possible. Over here is the take-up spool right here, and this is the supply. But since we're going to focus on this first part, and I'm trying to get the best picture I can, there's a couple of things that we need to pay attention to. One is the gap, the distance right here between the end of this emboss module and the emboss wheel. There should only be about 1/4 of an inch gap when this is in the stationary position. Before the solenoid activates and pushes it out, there should only be about 1/4 of an inch gap. This thing during shipping, or however, I don't know how it happens, but sometimes it'll get knocked out like that. So what you need to do is just put your finger on the end of this emboss module, and I will zoom out so you can see the whole thing there. You need to push your finger here, and you might have to push kind of firm, but just with firm and steady pressure, move it, making small adjustments. Let off because it'll back up a little bit until you adjust it back to where it's about 1/4 of an inch gap right here between. You don't want it pushed into the wheel because then it'll make contact when it's turning and you'll damage the wheel with these fingers. But if this gap is too great, it can not only cut the ribbon and cause issues that way, but it'll also give you a dirty card. When it embosses on these bigger numbers, on the OCR and on the Gothic, it has a negative image and a positive image. So it actually pushes the plastic, and you can see that it's called embossing. It pushes the plastic up. Whereas the rear indent, it's got a flat anvil on the top, and it has the positive on the bottom. So it's flat on the top, and it actually pushes the key, the rear indent key, into the plastic, pushing the black film off of the ribbon into the plastic. So it's a little bit different. But if this is misaligned and it's sticking too far out when you start, before the solenoid is activated, you'll get a dirty print too. That black film will get put into the back of your embossing on your card here, and so we don't want that either. So that's the first thing to make sure that we check, is to make sure, first of all, if it's really loose, then there's something wrong. We need to adjust that. But as long as it stays put, once you adjust it, then we're fine. All right. So I'm going to cut this to simulate a break. The easiest thing to do is to remove, and you might have, if you haven't changed it before, you might have these rear indent discs on, and it'll probably be taped because these things can slide off during shipment. So you'll just have to peel it's just Scotch tape, take the Scotch tape off, and they just slide along that slot off. So you'll need to take this one on the supply side. If there's one there, you don't necessarily need to take that off, but you will it'll make it a lot easier if you take it off on the take-up side. You can remove the used ribbon. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take this off for illustration purposes, because if you're installing a new ribbon, then that this is going to be pertinent. Alright, on the spool you'll notice that there are these little plastic injection spots, little round spots, and then on the other side it's smooth. The side that has those round little plastic injection, mold injection spots, that needs to be up. And also with the ribbon on the supply side, it needs to be on the bottom. So those little round dots facing up on the spool and the ribbon on the bottom. There's two little screws that stick up, and they will go inside of two of these slots. It doesn't really matter which one. If you're dealing with a brand new roll, it'll have some adhesive here and it'll be taped, and so it's easier if you just set it on first and then pull that off. But it's easy to let this come unwound, and it makes it more difficult. It'll go underneath this this take-up spool here. So if you hold it until you get and put a little bit of tension on this, hold it with this hand, set it down on the screws, and then pull and give it a little bit of tension. Now it's going to go around. Bring it down a little bit. Alright. So the first path, it's going to go around this rubber roller right here, and that's what there's a sensor on the bottom side, and you can see the wheel sticking out here with little gaps. That's what tells the system that it's turning when it spins here. So what you need to do is put your finger on this roller to hold it. You'll notice also that you have a shiny side and you have a dull side. The shiny side should go up on this first turn, so you gotta turn it up and then let it fall down to form and you might need to adjust here with your finger on that roller. But make a loop with the shiny side up and go around that bottom guide. So it should look like this. Then you can pull this out to make it easier if you'd like, or feed it around. So it's shiny side for these first two guides. The shiny side should be making contact with these first two guides. Then, as it goes across this guide and across the top, this is the dull side, and that's the film that's pushed into the card. And I'm going to have a little bit of a tight spot here with this tripod I'm using, but alright, so now that we got that, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that we can see a little better. Alright. Now, there's this guide, and I'm going to show a little bit later in the video what this looks like without the wheel on it. But there's this guide right here, and the ribbon has to go between the lower, this is the upper wheel, there's the lower wheel. It has to go between the lower wheel and between that guide. If it goes over the top of it like it is right now, I can slide it in and out. If it goes right there, it'll cut it every time. As soon as it goes out, this top emboss will make contact and it'll cut it. So you got to kind of pull it back and go underneath this guide, so it's between this guide on the bottom side of it and the top side of the lower wheel. So if you try to pull it out, it's caught in between. If you pull it out like this and it comes out, you're in the wrong spot. Bring it back in this way, take it down until you catch underneath. Alright, and there's two more guides over here, so we're going to go over the top of this guide and then loop it and go underneath the second one. So over here and under here, and then, oops, I dropped it. That will happen. If you can catch it, make sure that you're, yeah, see right here, this is a good example of what can happen if you lose tension. So this is a good example of what we'll have to go through again. It's easy, if you have a lot of slack, cut some off because that gets in the way. But get it to a point where you have just a little bit of extra and just go through the process again. Put a little bit of stress or a little bit of tension on it on this hand. Using your finger, hold it here, kind of pull it around a little bit. Turn your hand a half a turn this way so that the shiny side's up. Make a loop. Loop it around that bottom roller. And then over the top of that guide. And then underneath, between the this aluminum guide down here and the lower wheel, you shouldn't be able to pull it out. Over top of this guide, make a loop. Hold it with your finger right here, so that goes under that second one, and then dull side around this guide. Now you can hold your finger, this will move, but if you hold your finger here, you can help hold it. You don't want a whole lot of extra here because it makes it more difficult, but you can wrap it around and then hold it with your thumb or finger on one of these screws and slowly turn it. And it takes some practice to do that too, but then give it about a half a dozen turns so that it's firmly on there. At that point you can reinstall these. If you're not moving the machine around, you can use it that way too, but at this point you could slide your discs back on. And that's how that's done. Now we're gonna go over to this other machine. I call this my Frankenstein. It has the case taken off. It's got a cut wheel so that we can see what's going on here. Alright, so what we were talking about before, get this tripod set up. Alright. Zoom in here. Alright. This guide right here on the front, if this wheel was a real usable wheel, it would stick out further. And you have a Alright, should have had this out in the beginning. So here's your two wheels. Let me zoom out for a sec. Here's your lower emboss wheel, and here's your upper emboss wheel. So if you look closely, you can see that this is a positive of the characters, meaning that it sticks up. And then this is a negative. So this lower pushes the plastic into the upper, and that's what creates the emboss. This one does not have a rear indent key, but the rear indent, it's reversed because you're pushing in the back, but it has a positive on the bottom, but then it has these flat anvils on the top, so it only pushes into the back side on the bottom, pushes the film up into it. Alright, so looking at this guide right here, you can see that the ribbon goes underneath it. And if this was a usable real bottom wheel, it would come out underneath the ribbon here. So you would have the lower emboss wheel under it. The ribbon goes between this guide and the lower emboss wheel. And so what I'm talking about over there, if it'll cut it, 99.9% of the time when it gets cut, it's because this ribbon is sitting on top up here. So when this actuates and engages, you can see this hole right here. That's where the lower and the upper keys come together. And so when this actuates and this emboss action happens, it pushes those keys down, and that's where it's getting cut. So we need to make sure that we keep that ribbon between the lower emboss wheel and this guide underneath. Then when it engages, and how that works, just a little bit of theory on it. Take this. I'm going to take this upper motor and cam and everything off. Alright, so now we have a better look. And that shiny metal spot down there, that's the bottom embosser. It has these little cone shaped, sharp cone shaped parts on the back of the keys, and so those go inside of that hollowed out metal piece, and that guides the keys together. They'll come together. So if this was a good wheel, like I said, this bottom one, it would extend out so that it goes up underneath, so that that bottom one catches the bottom one, and then this upper one that I've taken off, if you turn it over, see, it has that same hollowed out thing to catch the top. So that's how that works when they come together. There's a cam that pushes the bottom and the upper wheels, the keys together to form the embossment. Back up. All right. So that's how it works. And of course, this spins to the different positions that it needs to be. And again, one last time, it's important that this gap is proper, because as you can see right now, the ribbon is not visible in this gap here where the lower and the upper are going to come together. In that hole between this guide, the lower one goes below it, the upper goes above it. They come together and pinch together in the card in that gap. So if your ribbon is off and you're starting here, when it embosses, it'll cut. It pinches in there and cuts. This is how it should look when it's embossing. It activates when it's rear indenting, and it'll push it out to where the ribbon's in the path of those indent keys. But just under normal embossing, when you're doing the raised printing, it should look like that, and that's why it cuts. If it's sticking out like this, when those come together, the upper and lower, it breaks. So this is what it should look like when you're done, making sure that this ribbon goes, it's a better shot right there, above the lower emboss but below that guide. And then make sure that you have no more than about 1/4 of an inch gap when it's in the home position right here. When it actuates, it'll, same thing. With the wheel, you can see when you move the ribbon, it pushes it into that hole, that gap there in that guide, and that's where it applies the rear indent. One last thing on the rear indent. Sometimes it'll give you a rear indent error when it isn't broken, it's in the right position. Most of the time, if you just give this a little turn like that, for some reason it's not sensing it. So if you give it a little turn and then try it again, it should work. There's one last thing that I'll show you that you can look at. There's an access cover right here on the front. Don't get in here when you don't have to. Don't mess with it. Leave this cover on, because this motherboard is very expensive, and if that goes out, you're down. But it has these LED lights on the front, and what those are sensors. It tells you when a sensor's engaged at the home position, or if there's a card present or something like that. So I'm going to slowly roll the take-up spool And you'll notice as I do that on that D23, it looks like that's lighting and then unlighting. That's the rear indent moving. So that sensor goes on that little wheel you can see sticking out right here on this roller. It's got gaps, and that sensor looks for those gaps, and that tells it that it's moving. All right, so that's again, don't go in there if you don't have to. That's just some information on the theory of operation, how this works. But it needs to be set up properly, correct, with the correct gap, the ribbon in the proper path, going below, above, below, then around this, and then also shiny side up until it gets to here. Then it's dull, then it's shiny again. Dull goes up here, but then it's the shiny. Except for the only exception to that, it's dull side going around this, and then it goes around that last one around that. So anyway, that's the how it needs to be set up for it to work. If it's not like that, it will cut the ribbon.